we're going to talk in this part about the nutritional needs across the life stages. And so far, we've talked about the adult daily nutrient requirements. So anyone in the age range of 18 all the way to 50, which covers most of us in this class. But now we're going to learn about the nutrient needs and how they deviate for different ages that are younger and older than the general 18 to 50-year-old adult population. So the way that the DRI is sectioned into age demographics looks at infants in the younger and older infant categories, several groups of children all the way from toddlers to teens, and then they break off into older adults, which says anywhere from 51 to 70, or elderly adults, which are anywhere from 70 plus. So those are the different ages we're going to look at, and the nutrient requirements increase and decrease across these age groups based on several factors that we will discuss. So we'll start off logically with the youngest age group. The daily recommended intake for young infants is actually only an adequate intake. So again, if you remember, that's just where we measure how much is typically consumed, and that amount seems to be good to produce general healthy outcomes. So the DRI based on adequate intake is based on a certain quantity of breast milk, and that happens to be 0.67 liters. So what they do is take 0.67 liters of breast milk, measure the nutrient content in that breast milk, and say that, okay, this daily amount must be adequate for nutrient healthy outcomes. So macronutrients, micronutrients on the right, a couple things to look at, looking at the fat intake. So infant fat requirements are actually much higher than regular adults like we've talked about so far. And you'll notice that of anywhere from about 500 to 600 calories that infants consume per day in breast milk or formula, about half of those calories are coming from fat, which is a lot higher. So a 50% calorie fat calorie diet is much higher than the healthy adult recommendation. So the infant diet is going to be a little higher in fat. It's also going to be a little bit protein despite the rapid growth rate, because protein is one of the harder nutrients for infants to digest. So because of that, human breast milk is very high in essential amino acids so that infants can have less protein but still meet those essential amino acid requirements. You'll also notice the fluid amount in breast milk, and then it's mostly, obviously, fluids, mostly water. And then you can look over at the micronutrient side and notice a couple interesting things like iron and zinc. So you'll notice that iron and zinc, the DRI is much lower. And, that makes sense as a function of the size of the baby being smaller. But really the reason the iron content is so low is because babies are born with a really rich liver and spleen endowments of iron. So we have lots of iron stored. Mom's breast milk doesn't have much. That also is the case with vitamin K, only with vitamin K, we aren't born with a great endowment, which is why we get that shot, that intramuscular shot at birth. So vitamin K, there's hardly any in breast milk, which is why it isn't even up here, but that's another important one to point out, that we get a shot of that at birth to cover those small short-term needs for being able to coagulate and, just in case there's an injury, the infant needs to be able to clot its blood. His or her blood, shouldn't say it. Also notice that the vitamin D content is relatively same as the normal daily intake recommendation for adults. And you'll notice that all the way through the lifespan until the very elderly years, the DRI for vitamin is 5 micrograms. So this amount seems to be adequate with sunlight, but a lot of new infants don't get a whole lot of sunlight. Moms get a little scared to take them out. And although it's pretty recommended now to take your infant out for a few minutes of sunlight each day, some people really use the sun creams, and it could be a good idea to supplement vitamin D to newborns in the case they don't get any sunlight. And this would of course be a topic for your pediatrician, but that's one of the ones you could ask about. So the RDA for 7 to 12-month-old infants, we have a couple good values with an actual, EAR that has been converted to an RDA, and we talked about that a long time ago, but a couple good sets of nutrients where they've been measured using balanced data and standardized equations. So if you look at total energy or calories, it's basically using the same kind of formulas that we've covered for healthy adults, and protein, iron, and zinc using balanced studies where we look at, the exact amount consumed in the diet and then all of the different sources of losses that we sum together, and then from that kind of collectively seeing how much the body is retaining and using. So for those nutrients that are listed, we have good RDAs for 7 to 12-month-old babies. For the other lots of nutrients that are listed, we have a little bit less good, estimates of how much is needed daily, but these amounts presented seem to be producing healthy children. So adequate intake for 7 to 12 months older based on several different methods. One method looks at, hey, we know these guys are still consuming lots of milk, so we're going to reduce the breast milk intake from that 0.67 liters that we talked about over here, right, 0.67 liters of breast milk. We're going to take that down to 0.60 because breast milk consumption drops off a little bit, or formula, and they start having a compensatory intake of whole foods. So milk intake goes down to 0.6 liters. Compensatory foods bumps up to an estimated 400 calories per day from a variety of different types of foods. And from estimating those together, we get these values for these nutrients listed here in the far left column. Now, again, these are just adequate intake values, but if you consume these between your milk and your compensatory foods, you're a very healthy 7 to 12-month-old. There's also two other types of adequate intake methods. One, we extrapolated down from adults. So there just wasn't enough information to figure it out from the compensatory foods and breast milk. So we took adult data that has been a little bit more carefully calculated or even estimated and extrapolated down based on body weight. And then we also performed similar methods looking at really carefully determined 0 to 6-month-old needs and then estimated that up to that 7 to 12-month-old category using body weight adjustment formulas. So I know that's a lot of information, but I wanted to give you a good understanding of how these RDAs and adequate intake values are developed for young babies, because they're so much smaller and it's a really, too much could be a big deal. So it's a very important concept to understand where these nutrient levels are derived. Moving along to the children in the 1 through 8 category, they're also like adults in that they have regular TEE or total energy expenditure formulas for estimating how many calories that they need, using adult type methods for estimating physical activity levels. And you can see that bolded in that equation here, where the physical activity is going to now be one of those factors in the equation where you want your kid to be active and not sedentary so that more calories per day are allowed. Looking down at the macronutrient category, we see our first split in age. So in the 4 to 8 range category, linolenic acid, it's the first time that we see different values for boys and girls. So reported intake or adequate intake for linolenic acid was higher for boys, and that seems to be producing healthy outcomes, where a lower value of 10 is reported for girls, and that seems to be healthy. So we see our first bifurcation in gender at that 4 to 8 range for linolenic acid. Looking at the rest of this stuff, the only other interesting thing to notice is the vitamin D is still the same as that infant level, even though there's a lot of growth that's gone on. And again, it's because our body will convert what we need from the sun to meet the rest of our daily requirements. So 10 minutes of sun per day, 4 to 8-year-old children all over the world, pretty adequate vitamin D status. So they went ahead and established that value for children in the entire 1 through 8 category. Looking at calcium, that's another interesting one, because we will look at calcium needs as we grow older, and there's a big jump in the next age category. So this group's interesting. It's a little slowed growth compared to infancy and compared to the pubertal growth spurt we'll talk about next, but they also have some interesting food challenges that makes them, we're lucky they're not growing as quickly. They have a lot of psychological food things going on, food jags we call them, or kind of food refusals. We also see older kids in this group starting to be socially influenced by foods and feeling peer pressures about eating too much and too little. So lots of going on with food psychology in this group, but nutrient needs, they're pretty mellow, not as demanding as the period before or after. The DRI for children in the older age group, the pre-pubertal and teen categories, where we can see that they're all pretty much split by gender except some of those minerals and vitamins. But for the most part, nutrient and energy needs, macronutrient and energy needs are all split by male and female. What we can look at here is the bolded numbers. I bolded a few to kind of highlight a couple of the problems that we have in the teen diet. So the teen diet right now in the United States, like adult diets, isn't great. And we've kind of lost control of kids by this age. They've gained a lot of freedom in their food choices, and they're out of the home a lot. So unlike the ages before where, mom is still controlling what's being eaten, this group starts to deviate into a lot of their own food categories. And because of that, we see a lot of nutrient deficiencies in this group, especially with girls. We see deficiencies in the iron group, in the calcium group, in the folate group, vitamin E, vitamin A, B6, etc. So lots of nutrients, the bolded ones, we aren't getting enough, both girls and boys, but girls especially. So we're not getting enough good nutrients because a lot of their dietary habits have shifted. And so now they don't drink near as much milk. They've replaced a lot of that with sodas and energy drinks and things of that nature. And they're not consuming nearly the recommended amount of vegetables. So they're not getting enough vegetables. They're not getting enough fruit either, but bigger spread vegetables. And we just really need to work on the daily intake of this group. So now let's take a jump. Age 18 through the 20s, through the 30s, through the 40s to age 50. It's a maintenance period. So really not much is going on in terms of what's happening physiologically. If there isn't a whole lot of outside stress, the body's just going to turn over in a nice normal fashion, maintaining tissues, and everything's just kind of steady. So at about the age of 50, we've seen some changes take place, which is why the DRI starts at 51. And then we also see some changes past 70 for some particular changes that affect some particular nutrients. So looking at nutrients, most don't change. And you can see that column here. So same for healthy adults as for older people. No change, no need to concern yourself with changes in intake. A couple of the nutrients, though, older people actually have higher needs, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but they actually need more. So for those, it's calcium, magnesium, and these are obviously both important bone minerals. And what we can see, or how they have measured this, is when we give an older person over 50 a higher dose of calcium, they retain more of it, and they absorb more of it and retain more of it than people they're younger, meaning that their calcium metabolism and the efficiency of that system isn't as good. So they have to absorb more calcium and retain more calcium, and maybe even to counteract calcium losses from, kidneys not working as well and XYZ. But this is one age range where calcium needs go boop up past the 12 or 1,000 mark at the 71 age group. Everything else, just a function of calories reducing in the lower intake section. So, we have less calories. So some of these ones that are based on calorie intake, like alpha linolenic acid, these are those adequate intake ones that, again, we're not super positive. So we just say, hey, the healthy people are eating this much. So for those nutrients, not a huge anything to point out except for sodium. So sodium is one that we see a drop because, yes, older people are consuming less calories. So they're adequately being healthy with less sodium. But we actually have a purposeful drop in sodium levels here because older people become less efficient at regulating their sodium balance systems. So these people, and they also have less endothelial function, and we'll learn lots about that in disease. But for these folks, keeping their sodium levels down low is going to be beneficial to their, their cardiometabolic health. So now that we've looked at some of the different nutritional requirements across the life stages, let's take a look at some of the food, beverages, and dietary supplements that we consume in our diet to meet those nutrient needs. So in the 0 to 6 month or newborn category, young infant category, the primary food supply is from milk or from formula. And we are very sophisticated in our ability to develop formulas to be very much like human breast milk. Now, as we learn more about breast milk, we develop better and better formulas, but at about the same pace, we learn more and more benefits of breastfeeding. So while it has been long recommended that breastfeeding is not only nutritionally superior, but there are also plenty of other behavioral and psychological benefits that are pretty much beyond the scope of our learning in this class. So we pretty much feed our babies with human milk, cow formula, or soy formula. And we've seen lots of things happen over time in the market where we've added, again, more human milk-like compounds like human milk oligosaccharide. You can see that added here. And some of those long chain fats that we've talked about like DHA and those long things that are good for our brain development. And now we can even see trends with GMO and grass-fed cows. So all sorts of the same trends we see in adult food, we see pressed in infant foods and newborn formulas. So kind of looking at the comparison between human milk, cow milk, and soy formula, big differences in macronutrient content because they're pretty similar in terms of the percentages and calories. But the biggest difference is that human milk has natural lactose, where soy formula a lot of times has sucrose. So it's sweetened with sugar. And I personally think that this could do a little bit of metabolic damage early on, just, one theory of many, but I don't like the fact that there are sucrose in some of those soy formulas. You also see in human milk, again, those natural milk oligosaccharides, and you're not going to have those in a natural form. They're going to be synthetic and added in cow's formulas and soy formulas that have those. Looking at the protein content, so the soy formula is much higher in total protein, as you can see, and that's just because the quality of the soy protein isn't as high as from human and cow formula. Being animals, the amino acid profile is more complete and higher in essential amino acids. So in order to compensate, soy formulas have more protein typically than do comparable cow's milk formulas. Other quick notes that are interesting, formulas, both cow and soy varieties are highly fortified. So you're going to see higher vitamin and mineral levels in those. And again, that's just to kind of account for bioavailability and because they can. So for instance, one area, I honestly don't think they're of huge benefit. I think the levels provided in breast milk and the perfect bioavailability of breast milk make that the most suitable choice. However, one nice benefit of the fortification of these formulas is iron. So we're going to talk next about the first diet, which includes foods. It's typically somewhere in the 4 to 6 month range. And this diet has a very important, we have to consider iron in this diet because baby's birth stores are running out. So one nice thing about cow and soy formulas, if you use those early on, is that you don't have to worry so much about the timeline with weaning, because with human milk, as we saw before, not a whole lot of iron in that, and baby needs it. So you're having to think about those whole foods and different sources of iron at that, or transitional formulas around that 4 to 6 month mark. So that's about it, comparing the differences between the human and formula. One other thing is you'll see proteins in the cow formula. Sometimes they're titled hydrosylated proteins, or even sometimes just combinations of free single amino acids. But this is because the proteins that come naturally in cow's milk are big globular proteins, and there's lots of them, and it's really hard for human infants to digest. So for that reason, you never give a human whole milk. It will hurt its stomach so bad because of the proteins. And so when they make cows based formulas, they hydrosylate or break those whole proteins into small little things that are easier for the infant to assimilate and digest. Looking at the first foods. So we're assuming that in this age range, anywhere based on readiness. So this really isn't an age thing. It's more of a infant can sit up straight, hold the neck up, they're interested in food. Developmentally, they're ready to eat. Anywhere between that. And I've even seen people go as early as 3, not that I'm recommending it, just saying it's doable. Anywhere from that 3 to 6, 7 month mark for people who are more conservative. 7 months, I've seen people wait all sorts of spectrums of time. But anywhere in that time when breast milk or formula may not be adequate for especially iron and other nutrients like zinc, we're going to start adding whole foods or transitional formulas. And I'm not going to talk a lot about transitional formulas because they're a lot like the infant formulas, except they all have iron. And so to again drill that point in, the big thing we need here is iron. And so you're going to see that most first foods, usually grains we start with in the United States. You'll see fruits and vegetables used in other countries. And even here in the United States, I have seen friends start with different types of vegetables and fruits. But for the most part, the typical recommendation is to start with a single grain. Rice is the most popular, and you'll notice on these grain formulas a little later here, you might try a multi-grain after several rounds of trying foods, but you'll see on all these products, iron fortified, and it's probably on this one too underneath. But iron fortification is a big deal in this age group. So you're going to give them 1 to 2 tablespoons, and that's going to count for a serving of grain. And we're going to count those food groups just like how we do for adults. 2 serving of grain, 2 serving of vegetable puree, 2 servings of fruit puree, 2 servings of meat puree. Of course, this is across time and being very methodical about the order and the time of how these foods are introduced. And I'm not going to go into huge detail on that here, but it's something to the effect of 1 new food, wait 4 days, watch for reactions. 1 more new food, wait 4 days, wait and watch for reactions, and then accumulate all those foods till eventually the baby has several foods in their diet. And obviously age is on their side now, so that more risky foods are okay to try. So as you approach in that whole 6 to 8, 8 to 12 month zone, we're starting to add dairy foods and more grains, because grains can tend to hurt babies' tummies, especially if they're high in gluten. I know we've heard of gluten before. It's that protein in wheat and in other grains that can really be hard to digest and assimilate. So we want to avoid wheat for quite some time until that 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-month mark. And with that, you're going to find all sorts of fun corn-based, wheat-based, rice-based, all sorts of baby products on the market. Some of my favorite things to use for fruits and vegetables, I obviously made my own in these cool little containers. Honestly, though, there are so many great lines of baby food. I can't say that I feel the same pressing need to make your own baby food. It's still a great thing to do for the unknowns that we could talk about, but nutritionally, there are lots of great foods on the market. But I used to love to use these little fruit mesh things. And this one's a cool one. It's plastic. They were cloth when mine were little, but these were great because they could masticate around, get the flavor of different fruits, get the juices from those fruits, and of course not have any kind of a choke hazard. So they really enjoy teething on those. And then up in the grain category, all sorts of dissolvable type teething biscuits that are really fun for the baby, and again, just taking away choke hazards. So dissolvable grain products. We're seeing dairy products introduced, and even probiotic dairy, very soft, gentle formulas, sometimes even with enzymes added. So again, we're not hurting babies' tummies with those yogurt proteins. And then these are fun little dissolvable yogurt products that are very popular. They have all sorts of fruit ones. They have corn-based dissolvable things, but lots of stuff where a baby can put them in mouth, no choke hazard. And those also count towards fruit, grain, and yogurt servings. Moving up to the toddler group. So toddlers are fun to feed. And literally they are fun to feed because they're still, they still believe what you tell them about food. So it's still fun. You can still make up stories and be creative and, give them some empowerment in their food decisions and play fun games with hiding vegetables and fruits in their foods, which we like to do at our house. But it is a really fun age group to feed. But with that, they are also very challenging to feed, and especially depending on the type of personality and the sibling situations and birth order, there's some challenges with feeding kids. They have food refusals and they get really picky and they like to exert control and power in this way. And they figure out very quickly that there's no way to, physically make a kid eat. There's just no way to do it without putting them in danger. So people typically lose that fight, or it's just a really miserable way to live. So there's a lot of things we could talk about, but I think for the most part, it's just being very flexible, being very patient and persistent, and, keep offering, keep trying, and let them be really involved in the picking of foods and the preparing of foods. And we're going to do probably a live session that will be some fun ideas about how to feed toddlers. But for now, the basics are just to follow simple food guide patterns where they're going to get 3 servings of veggies, 2 servings of dairy, 3 of fruit, 2 of meat, 3 of grain. So you've got this nice little checklist if that's helpful to use. But then to see how this looks in a breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then snack meal pattern, the foods all come together and they balance out to meet those food group servings if you went through and put little check marks. And so you kind of feed them just like you feed older people. At this point, you're balancing foods. Couple little things with milk, again, is at age 1, you can introduce milk. Their stomach is ready for it. But for toddlers, make sure that you're in the 1 to 2 year age range, that you're sticking with whole milk. It's still a big source of calories for them, and we don't want to deprive them of their much needed fat and calories. They all tend to drink milk in this age, or some sort of liquid product that they really do rely on for protein, and in the case of milk, minerals. When they get to age 2, it's important to switch to a reduced fat milk, and I don't necessarily think skim is the answer, but somewhere in the zone of skim all the way up to the 2% reduced, because we don't want to have them have excess fat and calories, and they're at this point getting lots of other foods with plenty of protein. Some infant and toddler foods hazards to be aware of. And I've sectioned these kind of like, just to keep them in your conscious every bite, like every single time you watch your kid eat foods they could possibly get stuck in their windpipe. So these are going to be anything small. So every time they're eating, you're watching for those things. And then when we're talking about different meal preparatory periods, we're making sure that we're heating foods adequately and storing foods in the appropriate cold temperatures. And this is because both young and old people, which we haven't got to old people yet, but they are more susceptible to foodborne illness. So you want to make sure, your 5-year-old may not get foodborne sick, but your 2-year-old might if you don't handle properly your hot and cold foods. So at every meal, you're paying attention to appropriate preparation, and you're never going to feed at any meal to infants and toddlers honey. That is like one of those number one no foods. And it's not because it's a choke hazard, it's because sometimes it can have in it botulism, which is a bacteria that causes it is a bacteria. Yeah, I was thinking it's an anaerobic bacteria, but for some reason that made my mind want to say virus, but it's an anaerobic bacteria, and it is very, very bad for little babies. So no honey ever, and it grows anaerobically in that nice anaerobic conditions of honey. So never honey. And then every new food. So as you introduce new foods, you just want to stay away from foods that are allergenic. And of course, in time and with small exposures, it's absolutely great to include these foods in their diet. But for the, 0, that's 7, 8, 9, up to like 15, 18, 19 months, just steer clear of foods that may cause allergies. And, you might see dairy here, but it doesn't mean that you can't feed them dairy. It just means watch for it. So as you're feeding that to them, just pay attention to their next diaper and things like that. So you're not, curious what's making them sick. You'll basically be able to trace it faster if you're paying attention upon introduction. So we're a little older, and we are now feeding kids that are not quite as picky in terms of, I'm not going to eat that, kids in the 4 to 8 range. I won't say they're completely rid of their food jags, but for the most part, these kids, they know why they need food, and they understand nutrition, and they understand the food groups, and they know how to balance their plates. And there's all sorts of different efforts being made at school. And I really bring up school food lunch in this zone, in the 4 to 8 and the 9 to 13 zone, but especially the 4 to 8 zone, because you can see I listed up here the number of servings from each group that kids in the 4 to 8 zone need. And in this group right here, I think the school lunches are great, because you can see that 1/2 to 1/3 of their daily needs for each of these groups are met by just having the school lunch that's provided for them. Now, I know school lunch gets a bad rap. I'm old, but it wasn't that long ago that I was in school, and I certainly hated school lunch too. It's because it doesn't taste amazing, and it has a ton of social and psychological things attached to it, which is also an issue with feeding kids in this age range. They go from not caring at all and being oblivious about peers and food issues to being aware of them. And so now they're more influenced by what other people have at lunch. And so whole point of this is, yes, school lunch has its problems, and it's not always the most amazing food in terms of quality and in probably what you think in terms of nutrition either. But let me say that the National School Lunch Program is regulated so that all of the lunches meet a certain criteria for limited fat, sugar, and salt, and they all have what's listed up here for food servings. And there's other methods. They can also do it by nutrients, and those are even tighter, where they're meeting 1/3 of the need for calcium, 1/3 of the need for blah, blah, blah. So point is school lunch program, pretty cool idea. It's meeting 1/2 to 1/3 of your kids' needs. If you can keep them consuming it, it's better than packing them a crappy turkey sandwich every day with a bag of Doritos and a pudding. So if you fed a kid a healthy bento box, great. But if you feed them what I have to feed my kids when I pack lunch every day, it's like not that great. So anyway, I also think it would be neat if we could at some point in the United States, because we can certainly afford it, to subsidize a dinner program too, where the kids not only get the breakfast school lunch program and the lunch school program, but they also get to take home a meal with them for dinner. And, I get there's problems with that. They'll have to share it with people, and their parents might take it and it might spoil, and I get it, but that's what we should do, and we could certainly afford to do it, and that would be meeting our kids' nutrient needs every day. Um, anyway, I digress. So a little bit older, 14, 18-year-old age group. These guys are not eating the greatest, like we mentioned with their requirements. They have a pretty high intake of snack foods. A lot of their calories come from high salty and high sugar snacks. They like energy drinks, and they have a lot more freedom with where they get food. And this typically involves affordable food out, which is typically fast food. So they like their Taco Bell, their wings and things, their burger joints, and things that they can go for a few bucks and eat. And this also includes convenience stores, liquor stores, and places where they can get chips, donuts, and energy drinks. So lots of problems with this teenage group, but probably similar in all across time, which is different foods. It's just now the foods are really bad. So they're exerting their freedom and there's consequences. So in the snack range is where I would focus. If I had a teenager, I would be focusing on, they like snacks. They're big on snacks. If you can just kill them with snacks all the time. They come home from school. If you can get down a serving of fruits and veggies in like some kind of a healthy snack right off the bat while they're hungry, great. And that way, when they start gravitating towards those pantry snacks or when they're out and about, you're not as concerned because at home when they are there, you're pumping them full of healthy snacks conveniently in their backpack all the time on the go. Here you go. So for teens, I'm not there yet, but when I get there, I'll be excited to share more ideas. I do know that kids in that group need servings of fruits and vegetables that are comparable to adults. I have pink showing girls, blue showing boys. And you can see that the food group servings look kind of like adults, 3 servings of dairy. We're in the 5 to 6 serving, the ounce equivalent servings of meat zone, blah, blah, blah. But one interesting thing I've noticed is I have a teenage sister, and so I have a lot of her associations too, and they are, a lot of them, experimenting with vegan and vegetarian diets. So I don't think that when I was in high school as many people were doing that. I remember a few people, I think I played around with it a little, but lots of teenagers now, whether they have a healthy body shape or not, whether they play sports or not, lots of different types of teenagers from all sorts of different profiling categories are trying being vegans. And so I bring this up because if you come into a teenage person who's a vegan, it's a super critical time for growth. They need lots of calcium, lots of protein. And so since they're not consuming dairy on a vegan diet, especially, animal sources of dairy, and they're not getting those high quality meats, we're making sure to tell this group to really bump up 5 serving of fruit, 5 serving of veggies, 11 servings of whole grains or grains, but mostly whole, and lots of nuts and legumes. So it's going to be hard to get the amount of nutrients you need if you are a vegan, but I fully support it if you've got a well-stocked household full of good whole foods in those plant categories. So switching over to elderly folks. So we've lived on that whole 18 to 50 category, same regular things we've talked about the entire time. Now we're older. So in this 31 or 51 plus group, we have slight reductions in the amount of each of the food groups except dairy and oil, which stay the same. And like we talked about before, it's kind of interesting, but calcium needs are actually one of the ones that go up. Very few go up, but calcium needs do. So we want to make sure we're emphasizing to older folks to keep that dairy intake the same. Get that 3 servings of dairy and milk and cheese and make sure you're getting all of those serving equivalents because they need that dairy. Now in the other food groups, we have a slight reduction, anywhere from a half a serving to a full serving of reduced intake. And that's just by function of, they typically consume less calories, a little less active, a little less lean body mass. Calorie intake drops, and so a little proportionally from each of those food groups drops as well. Big things to emphasize in the older adult diet is fiber, calcium, and protein. We want to make sure that we're getting them those nutrients to mitigate some of these natural losses with aging that we will talk about in just a few minutes. So let's talk now about some of the transformational changes in nutrient processing. So when we're really young and when we're really old, we have things in our gastrointestinal system and other transformational areas in our body that are affected by our young and our old age. So we're going to start with talking about the changes in the gastrointestinal tract, or I shouldn't say changes, you're born and you grow with these certain conditions and then they go away and normalize and then they come back when you're older. And that's kind of funny because it is very similar some of the things you have when you're very young to very old. For instance, dentation and teeth issues. So little babies don't have teeth and they can't masticate well, and they also have low mouth acidity. And these are some of the same problems that you have when you're an older and elderly adult. You don't have teeth, or if you do, maybe you have decay problems and maybe pain associated with eating, or denture problems that inhibit you from enjoying certain foods. Things with seeds and things like that become difficult for older folks. Also, moving a little bit down farther in the gastrointestinal system, keeping with our flow in terms of the order that we process foods, in the stomach, we have an increased gastric pressure. We also have a much higher chance of gastric reflux. When we're younger, it's from pressure. When we're older, it's from a weak esophageal sphincter right here. We've talked about that before, but GERD or reflux disease, where that sphincter gets weak, we have that reflux back up into the esophagus, and that causes a burning or a yucky sensation. And we see this in infants and very older people. They both need Tums. It's not called Tums for little kids, but same concept. And also, both of the stomachs of infants and older folks are also lower in acid. And in old people, this is actually a condition called atrophic gastritis, which is low gastric acidity, but it does interfere with the digestion and absorption of some nutrients. Moving a little farther down to the small intestine, again, lower pH. And we also see, because of all sorts of different factors, less intrinsic factor binding. So when we talked about vitamin B12, we talked about how it's absorbed. Well, vitamin B12 can't be absorbed unless it's bound to something called intrinsic factor. Well, older people, and potentially because of their atrophic gastritis or their low stomach pH, high stomach pH, low stomach acidity. Those are always counterintuitive. But because of that, they don't have proper intrinsic factor binding. And because of that, they don't adequately absorb B12. And we'll talk in future chapters when we talk about disease, but that's a big problem, especially for older people, because we talked before in vitamins about B12, and it's important in methylation reactions, critical for cell division. You can't age without good levels of B12. So it is a big deal for old people to make sure they're getting B12 because of this whole issue with B12 absorption and the intrinsic factor. Also, both young and old folks are susceptible to higher constipation and higher risk of diarrhea. It can be with young folks from too much sugar in the diet, and with old folks from either not enough fiber, reduced gut motility, like their stomach their gut doesn't contract as well as it used to, so it tends to sit around. The stool sits around in there. So we have higher risk of constipation and diarrhea in both young and old groups. We also have metabolic changes that happen in the bone when we grow, that we're also going to look at how it changes as we age. So when we're growing across time, our bones grow. And there's some detail in this in the text, but essentially osteoblasts stimulate bone growth. And as long as amino acids are available and as long as the minerals are available, all of those constituents go into the bone and they're laid down and they mineralize and harden, and you've got these nice bone tissue. Well, when we're young, this is stimulated by growth hormone. And growth hormone and other growth factors released from the liver all go over to the bone tissue and stimulate this whole growth process. Well, other big initiators of this when we're young are the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. So estrogen, testosterone, and then these growth hormones act on the tissues of the bone and they stimulate bones to grow. So again, as long as protein's there, otherwise amino acids, minerals are there, boom, the bone's going to do its job and grow. Now, muscle's kind of the same way. When we're young, we have all sorts of sex hormones going crazy. We've got the estrogen and testosterone coming. We've got insulin levels, which, every time we eat, our insulin levels rise. And then we also have growth hormone released from the pituitary, and we have growth factors released from the liver. So all these factors all together come over to the muscle and they stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So this is how our muscle tissues grow as we grow and get bigger and develop in childhood. So our muscle cells, or our myocytes, as long as there's sufficient amino acid uptake and as long as mTOR is activated via all sorts of different things we're not going to talk about now, but we will when we talk about exercise and weightlifting and bodybuilding, as long as all the conditions are right, those muscles are going to grow. So we're going to grow a long time in our bones and in our muscles. we're also, as we age, actually, I was about to get ahead of myself there. So now we go from 18 all the way to 50. And actually, before that, you're seeing changes here as early as, 30s. We're seeing significant declines in human growth hormone. And as we get down into our 40s, 50s, and even into our 80s and 90s, if we're fortunate enough to live that long, human growth hormone levels are really low. And so as a result of no human growth hormone, and as we age, we also lose the secretion of our sex hormones, we end up having no osteoclast activity. So now our bone growth is not only not stimulated, now we have to continue to break down our bone to supply our blood levels of calcium and vitamin D. So if I kind of lost you right there, I can see why. So calcium levels in the blood and vitamin D levels in the blood are lower when you're older. And so since we're not adequately replacing them when we're older, a lot of times if we don't, and because we don't have these hormones stimulating osteoclast activity, and we have low levels of calcium and D to stimulate thyroid activity, that's going to stimulate bone breakdown. So not only are bones not growing, no osteoclast activity, we also have stimulated osteoblast activity, and that's going to be breaking down those bones. And so we're going to be supplying our blood with our bone tissue as we age. And so that's how our bones lose density over time. Same kind of thing happens as we age. We lose all of those sex hormones. We don't have as an effective insulin secretion system. We obviously have no more growth hormone we're secreting. And to boot, most of the time we're in chronic low-grade inflammation in our older years. So as a result of that, not only is there insufficient muscle protein synthesis from all these factors not being around, but we also have increased protein breakdown or muscle breakdown because we're in low states of low-grade inflammation. And that causes catabolism or breakdown of our tissue. And so obviously lots of details, but the point is that as we age, we start to break down our bone tissue, we break down our muscle tissue, and both of these manifest to clinical conditions that we'll talk about in the output section. So what is the function of nutrition as we age? So obviously we've talked a lot about the functions of nutrition in adulthood, and we've said it's for structure, it's for regulated body processes and all those things. But when we're talking about being young, nutrition supports growth. I have up here some just interesting data on growth, daily growth gain for boys and girls. We grow so fast in the 0 to 6 month age category. We rapidly slow down, and then we pick up speed. And then annually, we gain tons of weight in the 13 to 14-year-old zone for boys and the 12 to 13-year-old zone for girls. We're like doubling our body weight per year. So you can kind of take a look at how fast we're growing as kids. We're doubling and tripling our body weight. We hit peak growth velocity right at this perfect point in puberty, and we have to make sure that nutrient is adequate. So we have adequate protein, adequate minerals, and obviously adequate calories to support all of the energy that kids expend, then they will grow, and they will grow in a really, really fast and pretty predictable way based on genetics and height and weight and all the different measures they take across time. The function of nutrients is also not only so that we can support growth during those early years, but also so that we can maximize our peak potential. So as you can see from all of these charts, we have a peak potential to our bone density. We have a peak potential to our muscle mass and our potential for strength. We have a peak potential for immune function, a peak mental health function. So we grow and grow and grow, and we reach a peak. And then as we live our maintenance years, eventually those start to decline. And so all of the patterns for these functions, these physiologic functions that the body has, they all go in this similar fashion. It's grow, 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 and then decline, decline, decline. And so nutrition supports not only the peaking of all of these different physiological functions, but also in the preservation of their losses. And you can see this is a perfect example up here where if you attain a higher peak muscle mass, then it will not deplete as rapidly during the older years. And the best example of this is bone tissue. The higher you get your peak bone mineral density in that 25 to 35-year-old zone, the higher your bone density is way out here. Even though you've lost some, it started higher, so it's going to end higher, and you're not going to have near the problems with fractures. So the function of nutrition really, when it comes to the ages, is when you're young, it's going to support crazy rapid growth, and when you're old, or actually also when you're young, it's going to support those peaks in your early adulthood, and it's also going to preserve it as you enter your elderly years and those natural declines happen. Now, looking at the measures of imbalances. So, boys and girls both have a tendency in the United States to eat too much. So, we have a lot of kids that are overweight, and that's because they consume too many calories. Now, in other countries in the world, they have underweight issues. And so, we use growth charts, which you can see in this little thing right here, to track both underweight kids who aren't growing well enough and overweight kids who are eating too much and growing pretty much in weight too much and not in height enough. We can track these things using growth charts, which is regular routine measures they take at the pediatrician. So here's an anthropometric measure, growth charts. We assess these over time, and we can make sure that kids are growing appropriately on these linear curves, so that we can keep an eye on their nutritional status. If they slip off from percentile ranks, then we know that something's dramatically changed in their growth. And so we can start exploring diet or maybe other health conditions that may be, again, stunting their growth. We also can take a look at body composition to look at how we're doing at our system and, if we're getting the right amount of nutrients. And again, this is only in terms of calories and macronutrients, but a lot of times we do assess how we're doing in our diet, even for young kids, babies, pre-puberty, puberty people, by percent protein and percent fat. So we know that boys and girls have different levels of body fat, but what I put up here was comparing it to adults so that you could see how it transitions over time. And we get to our set point at adults. This is the typical body fat range for men and women, but in puberty, you're going to see girls have a very high level of body fat versus boys. And that's okay. That's perfectly healthy. But this is one type of standard that you can use to see if if the girl is 42% body fat, diet could probably be changed. If the boy is 13% body fat, then he's either really, really muscular or he might be undernourished. So those are some of the different standards we can use, both height and weight standards and body composition standards. When we're older, we need more sophisticated measures. I didn't go over all of the biochemical ones and a lot of the ones that we talk about because we had to talk so much in the food and the nutrient requirement section. But when you're older, there are ways to assess how well we're preserving or mitigating those declined functions. So for instance, with skeletal muscle mass, there is a condition called sarcopenia, and it's when your muscle has wasted 2 standard deviations below the normal or the mean for someone your age and activity levels. And so sarcopenia results in muscle wasting or a reduction in muscle size. And this particularly happens in elderly folks in the type 2 or glycolytic fibers. And when we get to the exercise section, you'll know exactly what this means, but that affects the type of fibers that create power and anaerobic ability, which is why older people get winded so easily and they don't have much of a tolerance for any type of high intensity exercise whatsoever, because a lot of that sarcopenia attacks those glycolytic or those powerful muscles that would contract. So we do have measures, clinical measures, sarcopenia. We can measure muscle mass or using MRI, and we can tell them if they have sarcopenia or not using these types of graphs. Also, we can look at bone mineral density, which is again also indicative of diet. If you're not getting enough calcium or you're not getting enough of the minerals that you need to appropriately mineralize your bone tissue, not only will you not hit peak bone mass, but as you age and we accelerate bone loss with menopause and all sorts of other things that we didn't get into, but as bone mass loss starts to accelerate, we can measure that. We can compare it to people in your age group, and we can, just like with sarcopenia, say, wow, you are 2 standard deviations below the mean. That means you are at risk for, let's say, osteoporosis, osteopenia, which is before osteoporosis. So these are some of the measures that we use of how diet is doing to preserve lean mass and bone mass. And of course, exercise is going to be a big one of these for preservation of musculoskeletal tissues, which we will talk about that in the last chapter. Thanks for listening.